My hands shook the morning I opened that envelope. It was yellowed at the corners, the kind of paper that had waited a long time to be touched. The seal cracked under my thumb like dry leaves. Inside, wrapped in a slip of pale stationery, sat a small iron key, rust-bitten and heavy for its size. The note around it had been written with a hand that struggled, each letter shaped with effort, leaning slightly to the right, the way handwriting does when an old woman fights to hold the pen steady. My darling girl. That was how it began. I read it twice before the words sank in. My darling girl. Have waited 14 years for you. I cannot wait any longer. There is something in the barn. Don't let anyone take it before you get there. I sat down on the edge of my narrow bed in a room that no longer belonged to me, in a building that was about to put me out into the world, and I stared at that key until my eyes burned. No one had ever called me darling, not once in 21 years. And the woman who finally said it had been dead for 3 months before her words ever reached me. My name is Wren Calloway. Most folks who knew me, which was not many, called me Wren, or nothing at all. I was 21 years old that morning, and the state of Ohio had finally run out of reasons to keep me. The foster system does not believe in keeping a child past her welcome. When the calendar tells them you are an adult, the door swings open whether you are ready or not. I was not ready. I had 3 bags on the floor at my feet, 2 duffels and a frayed backpack. Inside them was every single thing I owned. Some clothes, mostly secondhand, the sleeves and hems, softened by other lives before they came to mine. A handful of books I had picked up at library sales for a dime each. A photograph of a man and a woman standing in front of a white farmhouse. I did not recognize the corners of the picture, worn soft from too many years of fingers turning it over and over. That was my mother and my father. They died on a rainy night in November when I was 7 years old. One of those slick black highways in northern Ohio, a curve they did not see a tree that did not give. I had been told the story so many times the words had lost their shape. I do not remember the night they died. I remember a knock on the door at my grandmother's house. I remember a woman in a tan coat who knelt in front of me and told me I was going somewhere safe. Somewhere safe turned out to be a long road. Foster homes that did not work out. Group placements when no one else would have me. By the time I turned 13, I had stopped unpacking my bag all the way. I would leave one corner zipped, one shirt folded inside, ready to move at a moment's notice. I had learned not to grow into a place. I had learned not to put roots down where they could be torn out. The breakfast that morning at St. Catherine's Home for Girls was the same breakfast I had eaten 1,000 times before. Instant oatmeal that had gone cold while I waited in line. Powdered milk that had never quite given up its dust. Toast burned a little on one corner butter that came out of a tub the color of margarine. I ate slowly. I made it last. I knew it would be the final time I sat at that long cafeteria table with the chipped paint and the carved initials of girls who had aged out before me. Mrs. Pierce knocked on my door at exactly 8 o'clock. She was the social worker who had carried my file for the last 6 years. A tired woman in her mid-50s with deep lines around her mouth and a sweater that always seemed a size too small. She had seen so many girls walk out the front door of this place that the grief of it had gone quiet inside her like a kettle left too long on a cooling stove. She gave me that smile, the one I had seen 100 times before. The smile that means a woman is about to deliver something hard and dress it up as opportunity. Wren, she said, it's time. I followed her down the hallway one last time. Past the rooms where younger girls were still asleep, still safe in the legal fiction that the state of Ohio cared about them. Past the cafeteria where someone was already mopping the floor. Past the common room with the old television bolted to the wall. The hallways smelled of bleach and old radiator paint. They had smelled the same way for 14 years. In her office, Mrs. Pierce settled behind her desk and pulled out a folder with my name on it. 14 years of my life had been reduced to that single thin folder. I sat across from her in a chair that creaked. She walked me through the paperwork the way she always did. Identification documents, birth certificate, social security card, The address of a transitional housing program that had a waiting list 3 months long. The number for a job placement service that last I had checked mostly placed people in fast food chains. I nodded at the right places. I said yes, ma'am, at the right times. I had been performing this part of myself since I was old enough to understand what adults wanted to hear. Then she paused. Her hand moved to a pale envelope sitting separate from my file, and something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe. Or curiosity. I had never seen Mrs. Pierce look surprised by anything before. There's one more thing, she said. This came for you a week ago, from a law office in Vermont. With everything else going on, I almost forgot. She slid the envelope across the desk. It was heavy. Real paper, the kind that has weight in your hand with a watermark you could feel through your fingertips. The return address read Whitfield and Associates, Burlington, Vermont. I had never known anyone in Vermont. I had never known anyone who used paper that nice. I opened it the way you open a thing that might bite you. Inside was a typed letter from a man named Cornelius Whitfield, attorney at law. He wrote in long, careful sentences the way men of his generation wrote when they meant something. He informed me that my maternal grandmother, Eleanor Rose Calloway, had passed away 3 months prior at the age of 79. I had to read that line 3 times, my grandmother. I barely remembered her. There had been a few visits before the accident, soft as fog, a blue rocking chair on a porch, a pair of weathered hands that smelled of wood shavings and lavender, a voice that called me little bird. After my parents died, the visits stopped. The system had reached out to her. She had declined. Too old, they said, lives too far out, cannot raise a child alone at her age. I had spent a long time hating her for that. When you are 7-year-old and your whole world breaks in one night, and the one person left who shares your blood says she does not want you, you carry that. You drag it behind you through every group home and every foster placement. You wonder what was wrong with you. You wonder why you were not enough to make her say yes. By the time I was 15, I had locked her away in a room of my heart that I tried very hard not to visit. Now Mr. Whitfield was telling me she had remembered me at the end. She had left me something. A farm in rural Vermont, 60 acres. A farmhouse, a barn, several outbuildings, and a savings account containing $12,347.16. $12,347.16. I had $47 to my name. I read the line again. The number did not change. I turned the page over to see if the back of it would explain how this could possibly be real. The back was blank. Mrs. Pierce was watching me. After all those years, she had sat in front of me. This was the first time her eyes had nothing tired in them. They were just curious, plain and curious. What is it, Wren? My grandmother died, I heard myself say. My voice did not sound like mine. She left me a farm. A farm. The word felt like it was meant for someone else. Girls who came out of St. Catherine's did not inherit farms. Girls like me inherited used clothing and government paperwork and a bus pass to nowhere. In Vermont, I added as if Vermont were a country I had read about in a book. Mrs. Pierce leaned forward. Wren, she said, this could change everything for you. Could it? I was not sure I believed that. In my life, when a thing looked too good to be true, it always was. There was always a catch. There was always man behind the curtain with a contract in his hand and a story about why what you thought was yours actually belonged to him. Still 60 acres, a farmhouse with my own family name on it, a grandmother who had pushed me away when I was small and fragile and had then somehow written my name into a will. Why? That was the question that would not let go of me. If she did not want me when I needed her, why did she want me to have her land now? I called the number on the letterhead from a payphone outside St. Catherine's. The receiver was sticky and the air smelled of bus exhaust and old rain. My fingers shook so badly I had to dial twice. Mr. Whitfield answered on the third ring. His voice came through the line warm and slow. The kind of voice that has been delivering both good news and bad news for 40 years and has learned to sound the same on either side of it. Miss Calloway, he said, I have been hoping you would call. He told me that my grandmother had been very specific. The farm was to come to me when I either turned 18 or age out of the foster system, whichever came first. There was a letter she wanted me to read in person. There were items she wanted me to hold in my own hands. He could not put any of it in the mail. Some things, he said gently, should not travel that way. When can you come to Burlington, Miss Calloway? I looked through the smudged glass of the payphone at the gray Cleveland street. There was a Greyhound station 3 blocks away. I had no apartment waiting, no job lined up, no reason on this earth to stay where I was for one more hour than I had to. As soon as the next bus runs, I told him. I bought my ticket with 2 folded 20s from my $47. The clerk slid the paper across the counter and never once looked up at me. The bus would take 12 hours with stops in places I had never heard of and would probably never see again. I climbed on with my 2 duffels and my backpack, found a seat near the back where I could watch the world go by through a scratched window, and I leaned my forehead against the cold glass. Ohio rolled past me first. Flat fields, gray strip malls, water towers that bore the names of small towns. Then Pennsylvania hills rising and falling like the slow breath of an old animal. Then New York, where the highways grew narrower and the trees grew taller. I dozed off somewhere past Albany. Sometime in the night, the bus crossed a state line, and when I opened my eyes again, the world had changed. Snow lay in patches on the rolling hills. White farmhouses sat alone in their fields like steady old men. Stone walls wound across the land in lines that looked older than the country itself. The barns were red, the silos were silver. The sky was the kind of soft gray you only see in early spring before anything has truly thawed. I had spent my whole life in cities and small towns where the horizon stopped at the next building. Here you could see for miles. I got off the bus in Burlington in the late morning. The cold smelled different than Cleveland cold. Cleaner, sharper, like it came from somewhere that still had pine trees in it. Mr. Whitfield's office was in a converted Victorian house on a quiet street, the kind of building that had held its dignity through 100 Vermont winters. A polished brass plate hung beside the door. He met me in the foyer himself, a man in his middle 60s, with silver hair and brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He looked like the kind of grandfather I used to imagine I might have back when I still let myself imagine such things. He shook my hand with both of his. Miss Calloway, he said. Wren, thank you for coming all this way. He led me into his office. The walls were lined with leather-bound books that had gone soft with age. He sat me in a worn leather chair and pulled out a wooden box from a drawer in his desk. Inside the box were Key's financial papers, a bank book, and a thick sealed envelope with my name written across the front in unsteady handwriting. Each letter had been formed slowly with visible effort, the kind of writing a person does when her hands no longer obey her the way they used to. She spent a long time on this letter, he said. She wrote it and rewrote it. She said it had to be right. He set it in my hands. Then his face grew careful, watchful. The way a man's face becomes when he is about to say something he wishes he did not have to say. There is one more thing, he said. Your grandmother was very particular about it. She wanted me to tell you in person. She said to trust a man named Walter Tanner. He has been keeping an eye on the property since her death. She said he was her oldest friend. He paused. She also said Mr. Whitfield went on more slowly now that not everyone who comes to your door will mean you well. She wanted you to know that. She wanted you to be careful. A small, cold finger ran down the back of my neck. What was she afraid of, I asked. Mr. Whitfield's eyes did not leave mine. She did not say. But I have known Eleanor Calloway for 30 years, Miss Calloway, and I will tell you this. That woman did not frighten easily. I left his office holding the letter in both hands like it was made of glass. I found a small diner a few blocks from the bus station and ordered black coffee. I did not really want just to have a place to sit. The vinyl booth creaked when I slid into it. The booth smelled of bacon grease and old wood polish. A pair of men in plaid jackets sat at the counter eating eggs in silence. Nobody looked twice at the tired girl with the duffel bags. I opened my grandmother's letter. My darling girl, it began. Not Wren, not Miss Calloway. My darling girl. I imagine you are confused, the letter said. Probably angry too. You have every right to be. I will not insult you by asking for forgiveness. I am not sure I have earned the right to ask. What I can offer you is the truth, and I hope a chance at the life your mother would have wanted for you. The letter went on for pages. She wrote about the years before the accident when she and my mother had stopped speaking. She called it pride. Stubborn pride, she said, on both sides, the kind that pretends to be principled until it's too late to tell the difference. She wrote that when social services contacted her about taking me in, she had wanted desperately to say yes. She had been 65 years old, living alone on a remote farm. Her hands were starting to stiffen with arthritis. She had been afraid she could not give me what I deserved. I told myself it was selfless, she wrote. I told myself I was making the right choice for you. The truth, my girl, is that I was a coward. I have spent every day since regretting it. She told me that she had never stopped thinking about me, that she had set aside money every year, that she had planned obsessively for the day I would walk out of that institution and into the rest of my life. Then came the part that made my hands go still on the page. There is something waiting for you in the barn, she wrote. In the back, in the tack room, you will find what you need. But my darling girl, please listen. There are people who may try to take what is yours now. Not everyone can be trusted. Trust Walter Tanner. He was my friend for 30 years. He is a good man. The rest you must judge for yourself. The letter ended with a line that blurred the words on the page. I am sorry I was not brave enough to be the grandmother you deserved. I hope this farm can give you the foundation I failed to. I love you, Wren. I have always loved you, even when I did not have the courage to show it. I sat in that diner for a long time. The coffee got cold. The men at the counter paid their tab and left. A waitress in a pink apron refilled my cup without asking. And when she came back a second time and saw me wiping my eyes, she put down the coffee pot, set her hand on my shoulder for one quiet second, and walked away without saying a word. That was the first kindness Vermont gave me. I called Walter Tanner from a payphone outside the diner. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. Tanner, Mr. Tanner, I said. This is Wren Calloway, Eleanor's granddaughter. There was a long pause on the line. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. It had gone softer at the edges, the way a man's voice goes when he is thinking of someone he has lost. Been wondering when I'd hear from you, he said. Your grandmother talked about you all the time, you know, especially toward the end. He cleared his throat. You need a ride out to the farm. It's about 45 minutes from town, and I'm guessing you don't have a vehicle. I do not, I said. We arranged to meet the next morning. I spent that night in the cheapest motel I could find at the edge of town, lying on a thin mattress and staring at a water stain on the ceiling, shaped like the state of Florida. My grandmother's letter sat folded on the nightstand beside me. I read it 3 more times before I finally fell asleep, and even then the words ran behind my eyes all night long. Walter Tanner pulled into the motel parking lot at exactly 8 in the morning, driving a mud-spattered pickup truck that looked like it had survived 30 Vermont winters and intended to survive 30 more. He stepped out slow. He was a tall man built like an old fence post with shoulders that had been worn down by decades of work and hands that looked like they had never been still in his life. His hair was iron gray and cropped short under a feed store cap. His face was weathered the way a man's face gets when he has spent a lifetime outdoors. His eyes were the steadiest blue I had ever seen. He stopped a few feet from me, looked at me for a long moment, and then he took off his cap and held it against his chest. You look just like her, he said. My mother. No, ma'am, your grandmother. I had been told as a child that I had my mother's hair, her gray eyes, her stubborn chin. I had never been told I looked like Eleanor. The thought stitched itself somewhere in the center of my chest and stayed there low and warm, while Walter Tanner picked up my duffels with one hand each, like they weighed nothing, and walked them to the truck. We drove out of Burlington in a silence that did not feel awkward. Walter Tanner was the kind of man who let silence sit where it was the way you let a sleeping dog lie. The roads narrowed as we left the city. Stone walls began to climb the fields. Houses set themselves farther apart. A red barn appeared on a rise to the east, then disappeared as we dropped down into a hollow. "Your grandmother loved this country," Walter said after a long while. "Said it was in her blood. Said it ran the same way breathing ran. But my mother left," I said. He nodded once, his eyes on the road. "She did." That nearly broke Eleanor's heart. He glanced over at me. "Your mother's name was Marigold. Marigold Rose Calloway. Most beautiful girl in the county according to your grandma. Stubborn as a stone wall, too. Marigold." I had always known it as Marigold Rose, but the way Walter said it, slow and careful, like a name worth saying right, made it feel new. We turned off the main road onto a long gravel driveway. A weathered wooden sign hung from a post at the entrance, the lettering faded by years of sun and snow. Calloway Family Farm, established 1892, 1892, 134 years. 5 generations of my own people had walked this stretch of land before me, and I had not even known their names. The farmhouse came into view first. White clapboard, green shutters, a wraparound porch that sagged a little on one side the way an old man's shoulder sags after a long day in the field. The paint was peeling along the eaves. A few of the windows had been boarded up against the winter. Even so, even in its tired state, there was something about that house that held itself upright. Something that had decided a long time ago to last. "Needs work," Walter said as he killed the engine. "But the structure's sound. New roof 5 years back. Furnace replaced last winter. Foundations as solid as the day they laid it." Behind the house stood the barn, red faded almost to rust, with a heavy peaked roof and great wooden doors that hung on hand-forged hinges. Several smaller outbuildings scattered behind it. Beyond them, the fields opened out and rolled away toward a dark line of trees on the horizon. 60 acres. In a city, you measure your space in square feet. Out here, the land just kept going. Walter walked me to the barn. He fitted a key into the lock on the great doors and slid them apart, the wheels groaning along the iron track. Cold air came rolling out, smelling of sawdust and linseed oil and old cedar. I stepped inside, and I stopped where I stood. I had expected what you expect from a barn. Hay bales gone soft with age, forgotten tools, rusted nails in a coffee can, a cobweb tractor under a tarp. What I found instead took the breath right out of me. The whole interior had been transformed. Tools hung along the sidewalls in rows so neat they looked like exhibits. Hand planes, chisels, saws of every length. Each one had its own peg. Each peg had been outlined in pencil, so a tool put back in the wrong place would betray itself instantly. Long workbenches ran the length of both sides, their tops worn smooth and dark, where elbows and forearms had rested for 1,000 patient evenings. Half-finished projects sat on stands, a chair frame missing only its arms, a cabinet door mid-sanding, a bowl on a lathe that had stopped halfway through its turning. But it was the back of the barn that made my heart stop entirely. A real workshop, not a hobby setup, a professional studio. Specialized saws I did not know the names of. Lathes, sanders, finishing equipment. Tall shelves running along the back wall stacked with boards of every kind of hardwood I could imagine. Each shelf labeled in the same shaky hand that had written my letter. Black walnut, curly maple, cherry, white oak, quarter sawn ash. Wood I had only ever seen in a finished piece of furniture, in a window display, and never in raw form, never with the bark still on the edge. And along one wall stood at least a dozen completed pieces. A dining table, a rocking chair, a blanket chest, a pair of bedside tables, a standing wardrobe with a crown molding that climbed in 3 steps, a curved bench with a back the shape of a wave. The wood glowed under hand-rubbed oil finishes. The joinery was so tight you could not have slipped a piece of paper into the seams. Each piece carried itself like it knew it was meant to last 100 years. I walked forward without thinking. My fingertips touched the surface of the dining table, and the wood was as smooth and cool as riverstone. I could feel the grain under my fingers. I could feel the years. Walter Tanner stood quiet behind me for a long moment before he spoke. Your grandmother, he said, was one of the finest furniture makers in Vermont. Self-taught. Started after your grandfather died, just as a way to keep her hands busy. Turned out she had a real gift for it. He stepped up beside me. She sold to galleries and collectors all over New England. That table you're touching right there, that one was promised to a buyer down in Boston before she passed. He shook his head slowly. That's where the money she left you came from. Every dollar of it. She earned it board by board, joint by joint, right here in this barn. My eyes burned. I had spent 14 years believing I had come from nothing. I was standing in a room that proved I had come from someone. Walter led me to a smaller door at the back of the barn. The tack room, he said, although no horse had stood in it in many years. Inside was a desk, a wooden filing cabinet, and a tall stack of plain wooden boxes against the wall. Journals lined a shelf, each one labeled in Eleanor's hand. 47 small USB drives sat in a row inside an open cigar box, each one marked with a number and a date. A thick leather ledger lay open on the desk. The page showed 20 years of sales written in long, careful columns. She built more than furniture, Walter said. She built a whole life. At the very bottom of the last stack of boxes, half hidden behind the others, sat one more box. It was smaller than the rest, about the size of a family Bible. Made of black walnut, the grain so dark and rich it looked nearly purple under the work lamp. The corners were dovetailed by hand. The lid was inlaid with a single line of pale maple running across it like a horizon. And in the center of the lid, carved into the wood in a long, elegant script, was my name, Wren. Below my name, two small words had been carved with the same careful hand. Open when ready. I knelt down beside it. I tried the lid. It was locked. There was no key in sight. She worked on that box for months, Walter said. Wouldn't tell me what was inside. Said it was the most important thing that she had to give you. Said you'd find the key when you were meant to. I could not speak. I just rested my hand on the top of the box and felt the wood under my palm. Smooth and steady. Warm with the patience of the woman who had made it. That evening, Walter brought me home for supper. His own house sat on a low ridge about half a mile across the field from my grandmother's place. A tidy white farmhouse with smoke rising from the chimney and a black and white dog asleep on the porch. His wife Martha met me at the door. She was a round, soft, warm woman with white in her hair and flour on her apron, and she pulled me into a hug like I had been hers all along, like 14 years had not stood between us, like there had never been any question. The kitchen smelled of pot roast and fresh bread. There was a candle lit on the table, real cloth napkins, a pot of butter softening in a small dish beside the salt and pepper. I had eaten in cafeterias my whole life. I had not understood until that moment what a table set on purpose looked like. Over supper, Martha told me stories. Eleanor was stubborn as a stone, she said with affection in every word, but generous to her bones. When Walter broke his leg 6 years ago and couldn't work for 3 months, she hired him to consult on her furniture designs, paid him full wages just to sit in her barn and offer opinions. We all knew she didn't need help. She just found a way to take care of us without making it feel like charity. Walter chuckled low and quiet. That was your grandma, he said. Hand on your shoulder, nothing in your face. Martha leaned forward. She talked about Marigold all the time, she said. Kept a photo of her on her workbench. Even after the accident, Eleanor never took that picture down. She could barely look at it some days, but she never took it down. I had to put down my fork. She talked about you too, Wren, all the time. She followed your life however she could. You weren't a stranger to her, not for one day of your life. Then Martha said the thing that changed the temperature in the room. You know, she said, Eleanor was scared once, years back. There was somebody trying to take advantage of her. She never told us all of it, but I remember her face. And I will tell you this much, honey. Eleanor Calloway was not a woman who scared easy. Across the table, Walter shot Martha a look. Quick, sharp, almost too fast to see. Then he set down his coffee and very smoothly he asked me about my plans for the farmhouse, the wallpaper in the front room, whether I might want to repaint the porch by summer. But I had caught the look, that flash of warning between a husband and a wife who had been married long enough to speak in glances. Walter Tanner was keeping something from me. I lay awake that night in their guest room. The bed was soft, the quilt smelled of cedar and lavender. Outside, the Vermont darkness was deeper than any darkness I had ever known. There were no street lights, no neon signs, no distant hum of highway, only the sound of the wind moving through the trees and an owl calling once twice from somewhere far across the field. I should have slept. I had been awake for nearly 2 days. My body was hollowed out with tiredness. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw the carved letters on that walnut box. Wren, open when ready. I saw my grandmother's shaking handwriting. My darling girl. I went to the window. The Tanner house sat on its low ridge. Across the field, half a mile off, I could just make out the dark shape of my grandmother's barn against the lighter dark of the open sky. And as I stood there, my hand resting on the cold glass, I saw something move. A small white light inside the barn, a flashlight beam sweeping slowly across the inside of the building, brushing past the gaps in the boards, winking out, then appearing again a few feet over. Searching, patient, the way a man searches when he knows the room is empty and he has time to be thorough. I went still, my breath fogged the glass in front of my mouth. I watched the light move for a long time, 20 minutes, maybe more. It traveled the length of the workshop, paused in the back, near the tack room, lingered, then began to move again. Whoever was holding it knew the layout. They were not stumbling. They were not lost. They were looking. At 2:15 in the morning, the light went out. I did not see anyone leave. I did not see anyone come. I stood at that window until the first gray edge of dawn started to creep into the eastern sky. I did not sleep at all. When the first birds began to call, I went downstairs and put on my coat and my boots, and I told Walter when he came down for coffee that I wanted to walk over to the barn alone before breakfast. He looked at me a long moment. He did not ask why. He just nodded once slow. You holler if you need me, he said. I'm half a mile of open field that way. The morning was cold and silver. My breath made small clouds in the air. The grass was stiff with frost crunching softly under my boots as I crossed the field. The barn doors were still padlocked exactly as Walter had left them the day before. I walked around to the side door. That was where I found them. 3 fresh boot prints pressed deep into the soft mud at the threshold. Large prints, heavy ones. The kind a working man wears, except none of these treads matched Walter's boots and none of them matched mine. Someone had been here in the night. Someone had stood right where I was standing now. Someone was looking for something inside my grandmother's barn. And as the sun cleared the ridge behind me and the first long rays of Vermont morning lit up the muddy print at my feet, a single thought settled itself cold and clear in the center of my chest. Whatever was in that walnut box, they wanted it too. I did not tell Walter Tanner about the boot prints right away. I am not sure why. Maybe it was that look he had given Martha across the supper table the night before, that quick shadow of a thing he was holding back. Maybe it was 14 years of foster homes that had taught me to test the ground under my feet before I trusted it to hold my weight. Whatever it was, I knelt there in the cold spring mud, set my own boot beside one of those heavy treads to compare the shum, and I committed the shape of it to memory. 3 deep prints in a half circle around the side door. Worn down at the heel, a scuff on the left toe like the man favored his right foot. Then I stood up, stamped the cold out of my legs, and walked back across the field, as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. When I came in for breakfast, Walter was at the stove with a cast iron skillet, and the smell of bacon filled the kitchen like a warm blanket. Martha was pouring coffee. They looked at me when I came in, both of them at once, and I gave them an answer to a question they had not asked. "Everything looks fine over there," I said. Walter set the skillet aside and watched me for a beat too long. "That's so," he said. "Yes, sir." He nodded once slow. He did not believe me. I did not believe him either. But neither of us pushed it. We sat down to eat instead, and Martha pressed a second helping of eggs onto my plate without asking, and the three of us bowed our heads while Walter said grace in a voice that sounded like it had been folded over and over until it was soft enough to wear. After breakfast, I walked back across the field with my duffels and my backpack, and I let myself into the farmhouse with the iron key from the envelope. That was the morning I started to learn what it means to live alone. At St. Catherine's, alone meant lying in your bunk with 30 other girls breathing in the same room. It meant sitting by yourself at a long cafeteria table while the noise of 100 lives swirled around you. It was loneliness with an audience. This was a different country entirely. The farmhouse was so quiet I could hear the timbers settling. I could hear the wind moving along the eaves. I could hear a clock somewhere in another room, the slow, patient talk of it counting out a kind of silence I did not know how to fill. The first night I tried to sleep in my mother's old bedroom, I lay awake for hours just listening to the house breathe. By the third day, I had started to fall into a rhythm. I would wake at first light the way the house seemed to want me to. I would build a fire in the wood stove from kindling Walter had stacked on the back porch. I would make coffee in a battered tin percolator that had belonged to my grandfather, a man I had never met. I would sit at the kitchen table with a thick mug warming my palms, and I would watch the morning come into the window slow and gray and silver. Then I would walk out to the barn. Walter had loaned me an old laptop, a heavy thing with a cracked corner and a battery that did not hold a charge anymore unless it was plugged into the wall. He set it up on the workbench in the back of the workshop and showed me how to load the videos from the USB drives my grandmother had left. The first video was dated 15 years ago. I sat on a tall wooden stool with a blanket over my shoulders, and I pressed play, and there she was, Eleanor Calloway, my grandmother. She was younger in this video than the woman who had written my letter. Her hair was more gray than silver. Her hands were steadier on the tools. She wore a flannel shirt and a leather apron and a pair of round glasses pushed up into her hair. She looked at the camera with a small, self-conscious smile, the way a person smiles when she is not sure she is doing the right thing. "I am not entirely sure why I am doing this," she said. "Maybe because I am getting old and I want someone to remember what I have learned. Maybe because I am hopeful that someday my granddaughter will watch these and know who I really was. Underneath all the mistakes." My granddaughter, 15 years ago. I had been a child then, 6 years old, my parents still alive, my whole world still whole. She had been talking to me already, across all those years, across all those returned letters. I cried the first time I watched that video. I am not the kind of woman who cries easily. The system trains it out of you. Tears in a group home are a currency that buys you nothing, and worse, marks you as soft to the girls who are looking for someone soft to push around. I had stopped crying somewhere around the age of 12. I had not started again, not really until the morning Mr. Whitfield set that envelope into my hands. But I cried watching her. I cried because she was speaking to me before I had ever known I had a person to be spoken to. That first day, I watched 4 videos straight through. By the second day, I had a notebook open on the bench beside me, and I was writing down everything she said. Not just the techniques, the philosophy. She had a way of speaking about wood the way a preacher speaks about the soul. "The wood will tell you what it wants to become," she said in one video, her gnarled fingers tracing the grain of a board of black walnut. "You just have to learn how to listen. A piece of furniture is not finished when it looks done," she said in another. "It is finished when it has somewhere to go in this world. A table that no one sits at is just lumber with legs." By the end of the first week, I had built my first piece. It was nothing fancy, A simple side table, 4 legs, a flat top, cherry wood because she had told me in video number 3 that cherry was a forgiving wood kind to a beginner. I followed her step by step. I cut my first mortise and tenon with shaking hands, and I held my breath as I tapped the joint together and saw it slide home like it had always meant to. When I set that table upright on the workshop floor and stepped back to look at it, one of the legs was a 1/4 inch shorter than the others. The finish was uneven where I had been heavy with the stain. It rocked a little when I set my coffee mug on it, but I had built it with my own 2 hands. A warmth spread through my chest that I did not at first recognize. It took me a moment to put a name to it. It was pride. The dangerous, fragile, real kind of pride that comes from making something that did not exist before you laid your hands on it. There was one part of that video number 23 that stayed with me afterwards. She had walked through the build of that very table step by step, the same way I had followed it. But at the end, almost as an afterthought, she had added something that was not in the written instructions. A modification, she called it. She had reached underneath one of the legs with a small chisel and carved out a hidden compartment no bigger than a folded letter deep into the wood. Then she had cut a thin sliding panel that fit so cleanly into the leg you could not have seen it unless you knew where to press. Every piece of furniture should have a secret, she said into the camera, and her eyes had crinkled at the corners. Something only the maker knows about. It is like leaving a piece of yourself hidden inside the wood. I laughed when I watched that part, the first laugh I had laughed inside that barn. It surprised me. The sound bounced off the rafters and came back to me strange. I did not put a hidden compartment in my own table that first time. I was too busy trying to keep the legs of the same length. But I remembered the lesson. I wrote it down in my notebook and underlined it twice. Every piece of furniture should have a secret. I would have cause later to remember that line, but that came after. I met Caleb Hensley on a cold morning in the second week. I was out by the road trying to fix a section of fence in the front pasture. A long stretch of split rail had collapsed sometime over the winter, and the posts had heaved up out of the ground from the freeze and thaw. I was wrestling with the largest of the rails, trying to set it back into place by myself when a voice called from the road. "Need a hand with that." I turned. A young man was walking up the gravel from the direction of the south road. Tall and lean, sun-darkened skin, brown hair that fell across his forehead and got pushed out of the way without ceremony. He was about my age, maybe a year or two older. His coat was brown canvas, scuffed at the elbows. His boots were caked with the kind of mud you only get from walking the same fields every day of your life. He stopped a few feet off and gave me an easy smile that did not push for anything. "Caleb," he said. "Caleb Hensley. My family's farm is about 2 miles down the road. Word got around that Eleanor's granddaughter had finally come." "Ren," I said. "I know. Your grandmother talked about you." He stepped up to the fence and took hold of the other end of the rail without waiting to be asked. We worked in silence for a few minutes. He drove a fence post into the ground with 3 solid swings of a maul, and I held the brace in the easy rhythm of working with someone who knew what he was doing was a thing I had almost no experience with. After the second post was set, Caleb wiped his face on his sleeve and looked out across the field. "Your grandmother saved my family," he said. I waited. It was about 6 years back. My father got thrown off the tractor at the start of planting season. Both knees shattered. The doctor said he might never walk right again. We had no money for hired hands, and the fields don't plant themselves. He paused, looking off across the brown stubble of the pasture. She drove over one morning with her truck loaded down with seed. Said she'd ordered too much for her own garden, and it would go to waste if we didn't take it. Then she just started planting, came back the next day, and the day after that, brought Walter and Martha brought half the church. They worked our fields for 3 weeks straight until my father could get around on crutches. He shook his head slow. She never called it help, he said. She called it being neighborly, but we'd have lost that whole season without her. Maybe lost the farm. He looked over at me. I owe her Ren, so if there is anything you need, you holler. We finished the fence together as the morning grew warmer. He did not stay long after. He had his own work to get back to his own father to help. But before he turned to walk back down the road, he stopped and looked at me with his face gone serious. You should know, he said. Somebody's been asking around about your place. I went still. At the diner in town, he said, couple days back. Man in a nice suit, asking who'd inherited the Callaway property, what kind of shape it was in, whether anyone was living in it yet. What did he look like, I asked. Older, maybe 60, gray hair combed back, the kind of suit you don't see on a man around here unless he's at a funeral. He had a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Caleb shook his head. Just thought you should know. He tipped his cap and walked back down the road, and I stood there in my grandmother's pasture with one hand on a fresh fence post, watching him go. The man in the nice suit found me 3 days later. I was in the barn watching one of my grandmother's videos when I heard it. The crunch of tires on gravel, slow and deliberate, not the rattle of Walter's truck, not the clatter of Caleb's old pickup. Something heavier, something that did not belong on this road. I stepped out of the barn just in time to see a black SUV roll to a stop in front of the farmhouse. It was the kind of vehicle you almost never see on a Vermont gravel road. Spotless. The chrome polish so bright it threw the morning sun back at me in hard knives of light. The kind of car a man buys when he wants you to know what he is before he opens his mouth. The man who stepped out matched the car. He was in his early 60s. Charcoal suit, well cut, the kind that cost more than my grandmother had left me in her bank account. Polished black shoes that did not have one speck of mud on them, even after a half-mile drive up a dirt road. His hair was iron gray and combed back in a careful sweep. His face might have been handsome once. It still had the bones for it. But the eyes ruined the picture. They were a pale, watery gray, and they did not warm up when he smiled. He saw me coming across the yard, and he smiled wide. You must be Wren, he said, extending a hand. I did not take it. Preston Crane, he said easily, as if my refusal had not happened. I was a business associate of your grandmother's. She never mentioned you, I said. Something flickered behind his eyes. Then it was gone. We had a strictly professional relationship, he said. I am in the high-end furniture business, galleries, private collectors. Your grandmother was one of my suppliers for a number of years. I did not answer. I had learned in the system that silence will get you more out of a man than any question ever will. People hate a quiet woman. They will fill in the silence with words they did not mean to give you. Preston Crane looked around the property. He took it in with the slow, appraising eye of a man who is figuring out a price tag. The farmhouse, the barn, the fields rolling away to the tree line. I could almost hear him counting acres. Beautiful land, he said. Worth quite a bit these days, I imagine, especially with all the demand from folks moving up out of the cities. Can I help you with something, Mr. Crane? The friendliness slid off his face like rain off a windshield. What was underneath was harder, sharper, entirely without warmth. I am afraid I am the bearer of unpleasant news, he said. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew a folded document. Heavy paper, embossed letterhead. He unfolded it slowly and held it out toward me. Your grandmother and I had an agreement, he said. A signed contract, a commission for a private client in Boston, 10 custom pieces, dining set sideboard, a pair of writing desks, total contract value $65,000. She accepted a $20,000 advance against the completion of those pieces. He paused. She passed before delivering them. I have, of course, been very patient, but the client has lost patience. He pushed the contract a little further toward me. The advance has to come back, he said. With my agency fee, it works out to $20,000 even. I took the document. It was real paper, real ink, a formal contract dated 18 months earlier. And there at the bottom in handwriting that looked almost exactly like the writing on my letter, Like the writing carved into the lid of the walnut box was a signature. Eleanor R. Calloway. I read the contract twice. My hands were steady. I had learned long ago how to keep my hands steady when I was scared. Mr. Crane, I said, I do not have $20,000. He smiled again. The same dead smile. I understand completely, he said, and I am prepared to offer you a way out. I have associates in real estate who would be very interested in this property. I can have a check in your hand inside of 7 days. $50,000. That clears the debt. And you walk away with $30,000 in cash. That is more than fair for a young woman in your position. $50,000. For 60 acres of farmhouse with 5 generations in its walls, a barn full of professional tools, a workshop my grandmother had built with 30 years of her life. I might have grown up in the foster system, but I had been doing my own arithmetic since I was 9 years old. I need time to think about it, I said. Of course, he said, but my patience is not unlimited. 60 days. After that, I will be obliged to pursue this through the courts. He handed me a business card. Charcoal cardstock, silver lettering. The kind of card a man hands out when he wants you to be afraid to throw it away. I will be in touch, Ren. He got back in his SUV and drove away down the gravel road, and I stood there in the yard holding that contract and that card, and I felt fear settle in the bottom of my stomach like a cold stone in a deep well. I went straight to Walter. He was in his own workshop behind the house, a smaller setup than my grandmother's, just a place where he repaired things that needed repairing. He looked up from a broken chair leg as I came through the door, and he saw my face and he set down his tools without a word. I told him everything. When I said the name Preston Crane, the color went out of Walter Tanner's face. He did not curse. He was not the cursing kind. But his jaw set in a way I had not seen before, and his blue eyes went so cold I could feel the chill of them across the workshop floor. Let me see that contract, he said. He took it carefully the way a man takes evidence. He held it up under the lamp on his bench. He turned it over. He held it close to his eyes, then far away. He studied that signature for a long, long time. It looks like her writing, he said finally. Then, is it real, I asked. He set the contract down and looked at me. Ren, your grandmother despised that man. Despised. She told me more than once that she could smell a con artist from a mile away. And that man, she said, had been rolling in it his whole life. But he has the contract. Walter shook his head slow. He has a piece of paper. There is a difference. He thought for a moment. Then he reached for his coat. Come on, he said. We are going to see the sheriff. The sheriff's office was in a small brick building on the main street of Hartley Hollow, between the hardware store and the diner. Sheriff Brennan was a big man in his middle 50s, broad through the chest, with a thick brown mustache, going gray at the edges, and the kind of steady presence that made you believe a problem could be solved if you sat down with it long enough. He stood up when we came in. So you're Eleanor's granddaughter, he said. She talked about you every time she came to town. Never stopped hoping she would see you again. I told him about Preston Crane. I told him about the contract, the $20,000 claim, the 60-day deadline, the lowball offer on the property. Sheriff Brennan's face changed as I spoke, a slow tightening of the muscles around his mouth, a cold light coming into his eyes. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, and he was quiet for a long moment. Same play, he said. I did not understand. He pulled this same play on the Hendersons last summer, he said. Before that, the Morrisons. Before that, an elderly widow up in Stowe, whose name I won't say because the family is still working through it. He waits until somebody dies. He waits until the person who could verify or dispute the contract is in the ground. Then he shows up with his nice suit and his fancy paper and his deep concern, and he frightens people into selling at 30 cents on the dollar. He looked at me. Yeah, man. The contracts are forgeries, Ren. Every one of them. But proving a forgery in a court of law when the only person who could swear to her own signature is dead is a very hard thing. By the time most families understand what has happened, they have already taken his money and signed the deed over. How do I prove it? I asked. Sheriff Brennan rubbed his mustache with his thumb. Your grandmother was the most meticulous record keeper I have ever known, he said. If there is proof that she did not do business with that man, it will be in her papers. A letter, a journal entry, some written record. You find me that Ren and I will move heaven and earth on it. I went back to the barn. I started in the morning and I worked late into the night, and then I did the same thing the next day and the day after that. I went through every drawer in her desk, every folder in her filing cabinet, every box on every shelf, client lists, sales receipts, correspondence with galleries up and down New England, letters from collectors, tax returns going back 12 years. I read until my eyes burned and the words began to swim on the page. I read until my back ached from leaning over the desk. I found nothing. Plenty about her real clients. Plenty about her work. Nothing about Preston Crane. Not so much as a sticky note. It was as if the man did not exist in her life at all, which I was starting to understand was exactly the point. On the fifth day, just after lunch, a county vehicle pulled into the driveway. A short woman in her early 60s stepped out holding a clipboard. She had steel-colored hair cut into a hard line at her jaw, a navy windbreaker with a county seal on the breast, and the kind of smile that was made entirely of teeth and nothing else. She introduced herself as Vivian Kane, chairwoman of the town's Code Enforcement Board. Standard procedure when a property changes hands, she said briskly, the words running together as though she had said them 1,000 times. We need to make sure the workshop meets current safety regulations, fire codes, electrical standards, structural integrity. She spent 2 hours in the barn. She climbed up on a step ladder to peer at the wiring. She knocked on beams. She measured the distance between the workbenches and the wall. She made notes, a great many notes. Her pen scratched on her clipboard the way a small animal scratches at a door. When she finally stepped back outside, she handed me a yellow paper. A notice of violation, 12 items. Outdated wiring in the back section. Insufficient fire suppression. Several pieces of equipment that she informed me would require certified inspection before they could legally be operated. The workshop was as of this moment ordered to cease operations. I had 7 days to bring everything up to code, or the building would be sealed. Pending compliance. 7 days. If that workshop was sealed, I would lose access to everything inside. The tools, the wood, the completed pieces, the journals, the USB drives, the walnut box with my name on the lid. Every piece of evidence I might use to fight Preston Crane would be locked up behind a county seal. This seems sudden, I said, fighting to keep my voice level. The workshop has been operating safely for 30 years. Vivian Kane's smile did not move. Regulations change, she said. She got back in her car and drove away. I went to find Caleb that evening. I told him what had happened, and he listened with his face going darker the longer I talked, and when I was done, he stood up from the porch step and stared off across the field for a long time before he spoke. Vivian Kane and Preston Crane, he said. My father has been saying for years that those two work together. She softens people up with code violations, fines, cease and desist orders, things that scare an old farmer half to death and make a property feel more like a burden than a blessing. Then Crane shows up with his offer, and people are so wrung out by then that $50,000 sounds like rescue. My stomach went hollow. This was not one man trying to take my farm. This was a system, a practice-patient professional system designed to hollow out the very people who could not fight back. People with no money, no connections, no lawyers. People who had just buried somebody they loved and were too tired to fight a county clipboard. People exactly like me. Preston Crane came back that night. He did not bother with the suit this time. He came in slacks and a polo shirt, which somehow made him look worse the way a man in casual clothes can look more dangerous than the same man in a uniform. He stood in my driveway with his arms crossed, and the smile was gone. I heard about the inspection, he said. I did not answer. Real shame those repairs are going to cost. New wiring alone is 15-20,000. Fire suppression system, another 10. He tilted his head, mock sympathetic. You will be in the hole before you ever pour your first cup of coffee in that house. You sent her, I said. He did not deny it. He stepped closer. His voice dropped to something cold and intimate, the way a man drops his voice when he wants you to feel how alone you are. I am being patient with you, Ren. I am being more patient than this property deserves, but my patience has limits. 2 weeks, take the money, walk away before this gets ugly. I looked at him. Get off my property, I said. Something ugly flickered behind his eyes. Then he laughed once, a short, empty sound. 2 weeks, Ren. After that, the courts. And when this goes to court, do not say, I did not give you a chance. He drove away in his shining black SUV, and the dust rose up behind it on the gravel and hung in the air a long time after he was gone. That night, I almost gave up. I sat at the kitchen table in my grandmother's farmhouse with the contract on one side of me and Crane's business card on the other. I had a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I had a bus schedule I had pulled from the rack at the diner in town. The next bus south left Burlington at 6 in the morning. $30,000. I had never had $30,000 in my life. I had never had $3,000 in my life. I could go anywhere. I could start over. Some city far from here where nobody had ever heard of Preston Crane or Vivian Kane or the Callaway Farm. I could rent an apartment, a real one, with my own door that locked. I could buy a used car. I could be a person nobody had any history with, just a woman with a small bank account and a quiet last name. I started to pack. I folded my clothes back into the duffel. I put my books in my backpack. I picked up the envelope from Mr. Whitfield and laid it on top of the stack. I picked up the photograph of my parents, and I stopped. I had looked at that photograph 1,000 times in 14 years. I had looked at it on bus seats and in bunk beds in the back of social workers' cars and in the dim light of a flashlight under a foster home blanket. I had looked at it so often that I had stopped really seeing it. I sat down on the edge of the kitchen chair and held the photo up to the lamp. My mother, my father, young, smiling, his arm around her waist, her hand resting on the curve of her own pregnant belly, although you could only see the swell of it if you were looking for it. Behind them, a white farmhouse, green shutters, a wraparound porch that sagged a little on one side. I went very still. I stood up slowly, the photograph in my hand, and I walked to the front window of the kitchen. I looked out at the porch where I had drunk my coffee that morning. I looked at the column at the corner of the porch, the one with the long crack running diagonally up from the base where the wood had split in some long ago freeze. I looked back at the photograph. The same crack, the same column, the same porch. This was the house. My parents had stood right where I was standing now. My mother had been carrying me in that picture. They had been here, on this farm, together, before everything fell apart, before the rain and the curve in the tree. My mother had grown up here, and she had been bringing me back. I did not know how I had not seen it before. Maybe I had not been ready to see it. The mind protects you from what you cannot yet hold. But I saw it now. I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the wall and the photograph in my lap, and I cried in a way I had never cried in my life. Not the silent foster home cry. Not the tucked away grief I had taught myself to swallow. The full, ugly, broken open cry of a woman who has just found out she is not who she thought she was. She had not abandoned me. My mother had not run from this place. Whatever had stood between her and Eleanor had been hard and stubborn and stupid, the way family is stupid, but it had been ending. They had been finding their way back. I was going to grow up here. I was going to know my grandmother. I was going to walk these fields as a child. The accident had stolen all of it, stolen all. I sat on that floor a long time. The kitchen grew dark around me. The fire in the wood stove burned down to embers, and I did not feed it. When I finally got up, I did not pick up the duffel. I picked up a flashlight. I walked out across the yard to the barn. I did not bother with a coat. I did not feel the cold. I unlocked the great doors and slid them open, and I walked back to the tack room and I started over. I started by tearing the desk apart. Drawer by drawer, I emptied each one onto the workbench. I felt along the inside of every drawer with my fingertips. I checked the bottoms. I checked the backs. The third drawer down on the left side, when I pulled it all the way out and weighed it in my hands, felt heavier than the others. I turned it upside down. I ran my fingers along the underside. My fingertip caught on a tiny notch in the corner. I pressed it. A panel sprang open with a soft click, and I caught it with my other hand before it could fall. A false bottom, tucked inside, bound up in a faded blue ribbon, was a thick stack of envelopes. I lifted them out slow and careful, the way you lift something out of a grave. 247 envelopes. I counted them later. That night I just held them in my hands and stared. Each one was addressed to me. Ren Calloway, care of the Ohio Department of Child Services. Care of one address after another, each one crossed out, each one redirected, each one stamped in red. Return to sender, address unknown. Return to sender, recipient refused. Return to sender. I opened the top envelope with shaking fingers. The handwriting on the page inside was my grandmother's, younger than the writing on my letter before age had touched her hands. The date at the top of the page was my 8th birthday. My dearest Rin, it began. Today is your 8th birthday. I hope wherever you are, somebody has given you cake. I hope somebody has held your face in their hands and told you that you are loved. I picked up another envelope. My 9th birthday. Another. My 10th. Christmas after Christmas. First days of school. Easter mornings. Random Tuesdays in March when she had been thinking of me. Letters about the farm in spring. When the apple trees bloomed white and pink, the sound of the creek in the early morning. Letters about how the wood smelled in the workshop after a rain. Letters where she told me again and again in different ways the same one true thing. I love you. I am thinking of you. I am here. 247 of them. Every single one stamped to return to refused. 14 years of a woman writing into the silence and never knowing if a single word of it would ever reach the child she was writing to. I sat down on the floor of the tack room with that stack of letters in my lap, and I cried for the second time that night. And this cry was different. The first one had been grief. This one was something else, something that had no name yet. It was the sound a person makes when she finds out all at once that she had been loved her whole life and nobody had ever bothered to tell her. I read until the gray light of morning began to seep in through the small window above the desk. And in letter after letter, I started to notice something. A warning, the same warning, written in a dozen different ways across the years. If a man named Preston Crane ever comes to you with a contract, do not believe a word of it. He came to me once. I drove him off this property. I have never done business with him. I never will. He is a snake, and he will come for whoever has this farm after I am gone. There it was, in her own handwriting, in letters dated years before her death. She had known. She had seen this coming. She had warned me. 247 times she had been trying to reach me. I looked up from the floor of the tack room. The first morning sun was hitting the high window. Dust motes turned slow in the light. The walnut box sat on the shelf above the desk where I had set it days before, my name carved on the lid. Open when ready. I was not ready yet. But for the first time since I had stepped off that Greyhound bus into Vermont, I was no longer alone. I was not alone at all. I called Walter at first light. I had not slept. The letters were spread out on the workbench in stacks I had organized through the night. By year, by the postmark dates, by the ones with warnings about Crane, and the ones that were only love. There were so many of the second kind, so many. When Walter answered the phone, his voice was rough with sleep. She wrote me, I said. My voice came out cracked and wrong. She wrote me 247 times, Walter. I have them. I have them all. There was a long quiet on the line. "I am coming over," he said. He came across the field with Martha behind him, the two of them moving as fast as a man and woman in their 60s move when something is breaking in another person's life. Martha came in the kitchen door and looked at me, and she did not ask one question. She just opened her arms, and I walked into them, and that round, soft, warm woman held me while I cried into her shoulder for the third time in 12 hours. Walter stood in the doorway and watched the floor. When I had quieted, he made coffee. Real coffee, not the percolator I had been struggling with. He moved around the kitchen as if he had been making coffee in this house for 30 years, which I realized he had. He set a mug in front of me. He sat down across from me at the table where I had nearly given up the night before. Martha read 3 of the letters. Not many. She did not need many. She set the third one down and pressed her hand flat against the table, and she said very softly, "That woman." "That woman," Walter agreed. Then he looked up at me with those steady blue eyes. "You are going to fight him," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir. Then we are going to fight him with you." That was when Walter Tanner picked up the phone in my grandmother's kitchen and called the first number, and then the second, and then the third. He called the pastor at the Methodist church. He called the woman who ran the hardware store. He called Caleb's father. He called 4 men I had never heard of, and 1 woman I had never heard of, and somebody named Hollis, whose voice came through the receiver loud enough that I could hear him laugh once sharp and say, "Well, it's about time." By noon, there were 6 pickup trucks parked in my driveway. By 2, there were 11. By the end of the afternoon, 18 people stood in front of my barn with toolboxes and rolls of electrical wire with donated fire extinguishers with a brand new commercial fire suppression system still in its shipping crate that someone had paid for that morning out of their own pocket, with thermoses of coffee and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and a folding card table set up in the yard where Martha had begun to lay out food the way she had laid it out for funerals and harvests and barn raisings her whole adult life. Walter walked up to me as the work began. He took off his cap and held it in both hands the way he had the morning we met. "Your grandmother took care of this town for 40 years, he said. He did not look at me. He looked out across the yard at the people moving in and out of the barn. She made furniture for that church for free. She fixed Martin's roof after the storm. She planted the Hensley fields for 3 weeks in the spring of 19. He paused. "Now it is our turn," he said. I did not know what to say. I had spent 14 years convinced that I had no one. I stood in my driveway in the cold spring sun and watched 18 people fix the home that my grandmother had left me because she had spent her life making sure they would. They worked for 5 days. Electricians I had never met rewired the back of the workshop to current code and beyond. A retired contractor named Ed climbed up into the loft and reinforced 2 beams that had needed it for a decade. The fire suppression system went in on the 3rd day. By the morning of the 6th day, a different county inspector walked through the barn with his clipboard and his pen, and he stopped in the middle of the back room, and he turned slowly in a circle, and he said out loud to no one in particular that he had not seen a workshop this far above code in the entire county. The cease and desist order was lifted that afternoon. Vivian Kane's weapon had turned to dust in her hand, but I still had Preston Crane. The 2-week deadline had narrowed to 8 days. I still did not have the proof Sheriff Brennan needed. The letters were not enough. They were her word against a forged signature, and a court would say a grandmother's loving warnings to a child she had never met were sentiment, not evidence. I needed more. On the 8th night, I sat alone in the barn and loaded the last video on my grandmother's list onto the laptop. Video number 47, the final one she had ever made. She looked older in this video than in any of the others, frailer. The skin of her face had thinned the way it does at the very end. Her hands shook as she adjusted the camera. Her breath was short, but her eyes were sharp, sharp as a chisel just off the stone. "Ren," she said. She was looking right into the lens, and although I knew she had recorded this months before her death, although I knew the woman who had spoken those words was already in the ground and beyond reach, it felt for one strange moment as though she was speaking to me right then, from across that table, from across that distance, from the other side of a door I could not yet see. If you are watching this, she said, then I am gone, and you are trying to figure out what to do with everything I have left behind. She smiled. I do not know if you will want to learn this craft. I do not know if you will keep this farm or sell it. Whatever you decide, my darling girl, I will understand. I just wanted you to know one thing. You come from a line of makers and creators. Your great-great-grandfather built this barn with his own hands. Your grandfather laid the stone walls along the north pasture. Your mother painted, did you know that? She was a beautiful artist before she left Vermont. It is in your blood, Wren, the need to make something that lasts. She paused, then she leaned forward. Now listen carefully, she said. This is the most important thing I have to tell you. If anyone ever comes to you claiming I owed them money, if anyone ever shows you a contract with my signature on it that you do not recognize, if a man named Preston Crane comes to your door, do not believe a single word. She reached off camera and lifted up a piece of paper. She held it up to the light. This is my real signature, she said. Eleanor R. Calloway. The handwriting on this paper was the handwriting from my letter, from the lid of the box, from 247 envelopes. But she was tapping the paper, tapping just under the capital letter at the start of her first name. See this little mark, she said, right under the E. It is barely visible. You have to know to look for it. It is a tiny tick of the pen, just a small flick, no bigger than the head of a pin. I have been adding that mark to every document I have signed since your grandfather died. Every check, every contract, every legal paper, every birthday card to you. She lowered the paper. It is my way of being absolutely certain that no one can ever forge my name. If anyone shows you a signature that does not have this mark, you will know. You will know. I paused the video. I sat there in the coal barn with my heart hammering against my ribs. The mark under the E. I scrambled for the contract Crane had given me. I held it up under the work lamp. I bent close. I studied the signature on the bottom of the page. Eleanor R. Calloway. The handwriting was good. Whoever had done it had practiced. The letters laid down on the page in the right rhythm. The flourish on the C was right, but there was no mark under the E. Nothing. The signature was a forgery. I let out a breath I did not know I had been holding. My hand was shaking. The hand that had held the contract was shaking the way it had not shaken in front of Crane the day he gave it to me. But she was not finished. I unpaused the video. There is one more thing my grandmother said, and her voice was even quieter now. The box. The walnut box. The one with your name carved on the lid. She smiled, a small private smile. I have hidden the key to that box in a place that only a true craftsman could find. When you have learned enough of this work to understand what I have been trying to teach you, you will know exactly where to look. The video ended. The laptop screen went dark. I sat alone in the back of the workshop, surrounded by the tools my grandmother had used for 30 years, with a forged contract in one hand and the answer to a riddle hanging in the air just out of reach. And I knew two things. I had what I needed to break Preston Crane, but I needed more than that. I needed what was in that box. I spent 3 days looking for the key. I checked every place a key might be hidden in that workshop. The drawers, the shelves, the undersides of the workbenches, the rafters. I climbed up into the loft and felt along every joist. I tipped over every can of nails. I emptied the cigar box of USB drives. I went through the journals page by page in case she had taped it inside one of them. I found nothing. By the third night, I was so tired my hands shook when I held them out in front of me. Caleb came by that evening the way he had been coming by quietly every day or two to chop wood I had not asked him to chop and stack it on the back porch and leave without making a thing of it. He found me sitting at the workbench, staring at a chisel, like the chisel was going to start talking. He did not say anything for a while. He pulled up another stool. He sat down. You said it would be somewhere only a craftsman would find it, he said finally. That is what she said. He thought about that. Ren, he said, you have only been a craftsman for about 2 weeks. I looked up at him. So if she meant it, he said slowly, then the place she hid it has to be in something you would actually find, something you would build yourself, something you would learn how to make in your first weeks here. I stared at him, something I would build. Caleb had stood up to put more wood on the fire. The light from the open stove door fell across the workshop floor in a long, warm rectangle and caught the corner of the small cherry table that I had built in my first week. The one with one leg a quarter-inch shorter than the others. The one that rocked when I set my coffee on it. Video number 23. The modification, the hidden compartment. Every piece of furniture should have a secret, something only the maker knows about. I came up off the stool so fast I knocked it over. I crossed the workshop floor in 3 steps. I knelt down beside the cherry table. I put my hands on it. I tipped it over onto its side carefully, gently, the way you handle a thing you have begun to love. The 4 legs stuck up in the air. I felt along the inside of each one. 3 of them were solid wood. The fourth? The fourth had the faintest seam. So fine you could not have seen it without knowing it was there. So clean you could not have felt it unless your hands had begun to learn the language of wood. I pressed my thumb against it. A small panel popped open with a soft click. I caught my breath. Inside the hollow leg, wrapped in a square of dark green velvet, was a small brass key. My hand was shaking when I picked it up. Caleb knelt down beside me. He did not say anything. He just looked at the key in my palm. She did this, I said. She built this into the table I built. She knew. She knew that if I had learned enough to find it, I had learned enough to keep it. Caleb let out a long, slow breath. That is your grandmother, he said quietly. I carried the key into the tack room. The walnut box sat where I had left it on the shelf. My name on the lid, in long, careful script. Open when ready. I lifted it down. I set it on the desk. I sat down in front of it and I held the key in both hands for a long moment before I put it in. The lock turned with a soft, perfect click. I lifted the lid. Inside the box were 3 things. The first was a leather-bound journal smaller than the others on her shelves. The cover was plain. The pages had been turned so often the corners were worn soft. I opened it. The handwriting was hers. I leafed through to a page near the front dated 8 years before her death. I read it twice. Preston Crane came to the barn today. I set the journal down flat on the desk so I could read it without my hands shaking on it. He brought a contract and tried to pressure me into signing it. He told me the commission was already promised, that the buyers were already lined up. He said it would be the easiest $20,000 I had ever made. I looked him in the eye and I told him to leave my property and never come back. I told him that I had heard about the other families he had worked. He did not deny a thing. He just smiled at me the way a snake smiles, and he told me I would regret it. She had taped a copy of the unsigned contract to the next page. The same format, the same language, the same paper, the same lined-up commission. Almost word for word the contract Preston Crane had handed me 3 weeks ago. Unsigned. Blank where her name should have been. Below it in red ink, in her own steady hand from 8 years ago, she had written, "Keep this as evidence. He will try again someday. If not with me, then with whoever is left to inherit this place." I had to put my head down on the desk for a moment. I had to breathe. She had known. 8 years ago. She had foreseen this exact moment. She had built the proof I would need and set it inside a locked box that only her craft could open, and she had trusted that I would become enough of her to find it. The second item in the box was a manila envelope. I opened it. Inside were bank statements going back 20 years, property records, tax documents, and a notarized letter from Cornelius Whitfield dated 6 months before her death, formally certifying that Eleanor R. Calloway had never in her life entered into any business arrangement of any kind with Preston Crane or with any company associated with him. A letter from a lawyer of 30 years standing in the state of Vermont, notarized, dated, sworn. Sheriff Brennan's voice came back to me. You find me proof, Ren and I will move heaven and earth on it. I had it. But the third item in the box was the one that broke me open. It was an envelope, plain white, not heavy paper, not embossed, not the kind of envelope my grandmother had used. The handwriting on the front was different, younger, steadier, without the tremor of an old woman's hand. It was addressed to Eleanor Calloway at the farm. The return address was in Ohio. The handwriting was my mother's. I did not need to compare it to anything. I had carried 2 cards in my pocket through 100 foster placements that had been signed in that hand. I knew it the way you know the sound of a voice you have not heard in 14 years and will know forever. The envelope was dated 3 days before the accident. I picked it up. I held it in both hands. For a long time, I could not open it. I was not sure my heart could survive what was inside. When I finally lifted the flap, the paper inside was a single sheet folded twice. I opened it. Dear Mom, that was how it began. Not Mother, not Eleanor, Mom, like a daughter. Like a daughter who loved her mother in spite of everything that had stood between them. Like a daughter who had finally remembered how to say it. I have been trying to write this letter for months, my mother had written. I could never find the right words. So I am just going to say it. I am sorry. I am sorry for leaving the way I did. I am sorry for the years of silence. I am sorry for the pride that kept me away. I had to stop. I had to set the page down on the desk for a moment. I had to remember how to breathe. David and I have been talking about what kind of life we want for Ren, my mother had written. And I keep thinking about the farm, about Vermont, about all the things I ran away from when I was too young and too angry to understand what I was leaving. I want Ren to know where she comes from. I want her to walk those fields the way I walked them as a girl. I want her to learn about our family. I want her to understand that she has roots, even if her mother spent half her life pretending she did not. Were you planning to come visit this summer? My mother had written. I know it has been too long. I know I have no right to ask you to forgive me. But I am asking anyway. I want to come home, Mom. I want to bring your granddaughter to meet you. I want to start over. I love you. I have always loved you, even when I was too stubborn to say it out loud. I hope it is not too late. Your daughter, Marigold. 3 days later. 3 days later on a slick black highway in northern Ohio, in a curve she did not see in a tree that did not give, she had been killed. They had never made it. She had been 3 days from coming home. I sat there in that tack room with my mother's letter in my lap and the unfinished story of a family in pieces all around me, and I cried in a way that emptied me. The grief of it was as old as I was. The relief of it was newer. They had been on their way. They had been finding their way. The accident had taken them. The accident, not my mother's choice, not my father's choice, not any failure of love. I had been wanted. I had always been wanted. And my grandmother, who had spent every day of 14 years writing to me into the dark, had carried that letter through every one of those years like a sacred thing. She had not been able to give Marigold's child a childhood, so she had built her instead a foundation, a craft, a home, a way to belong to something larger than herself. She had built me a place to come home to. I sat in that tack room until the sky outside the small window had gone gray, then pink, then gold. Then I dried my face and I picked up the phone. Sheriff Brennan came to the farm an hour later. He was still in uniform from his early shift. He came through the barn door with that steady, solid presence of his, and he did not ask what I had found. He just took off his hat, set it on the workbench, and waited. I laid it all out for him. The journal entry, the unsigned contract from 8 years before, Crane's own words in my grandmother's hand, the notarized letter from Mr. Whitfield, the video of her holding up her real signature, her own thumb tapping under the E. I laid Crane's contract down on the bench beside hers. I pointed at the small mark beneath her real signature. Then at its absence on his. Sheriff Brennan studied them for a long time. He looked up at me. This is it, he said. This is the case. This combined with what we have on him from the Hendersons and the Morrisons. We can finally put him where he belongs. He leaned over the workbench. And Vivian Kane, he said, we have suspected for years. If we can connect her financials to Crane's, the whole thing comes apart. What do I need to do? I asked. Sheriff Brennan gave me a small, tight smile, the smile of a man who had been waiting for this day for a long time. When is he supposed to come back for your answer? Friday morning, I said. We will be ready, he said. Those last few days were the longest of my life. I worked in the barn to keep my hands from shaking. I worked on a piece I had been planning in a small chest of drawers. Nothing fancy. Caleb came by every day. Sometimes he helped. Sometimes he just sat on the stool and kept me company. We did not talk much. There was not much to say. Walter Tanner came over on the morning of the fourth day. He did not knock. He never knocked. He just walked in through the kitchen door, set his cap on the table, and poured himself a cup of coffee out of the percolator. Whatever happens Friday, he said, you should know something. I waited. You have already won the part of this that matters, he said. He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at the cap on the table. She wrote you 247 times. Your mother was 3 days from bringing you home. You are standing exactly where they both wanted you to be. Crane cannot take that. The courts cannot take that. The county cannot take that. It is yours, Wren. Whatever you do with the land, whatever you do with the workshop, that part of it is already yours. I could not answer him. I just nodded. He drained his coffee. He picked up his cap. He patted my shoulder once on his way out the door. That was all he said. That was all he had to say. Friday morning came cold and bright. I stood in the kitchen of my grandmother's farmhouse drinking coffee I could not taste. My grandmother's letter was folded in my left pocket. My mother's letter was folded in my right. I had been carrying them both like that every day since I had found them. 2 pieces of paper made of love. The only armor I had ever owned. The crunch of tires on gravel came at 10 o'clock. I walked outside on legs that did not feel like mine. Preston Crane stepped out of his shining black SUV. He smiled when he saw me. I have to give him this much. He thought he had won. He did not see Sheriff Brennan's cruiser parked just beyond the curve of the driveway. He did not see the deputies standing at the edge of the property. He saw a young woman alone on a porch 8 days from a court case she could not afford to lose. He thought he had broken me already. So, Wren, he said, have you come to your senses? I walked down the porch steps. I had a folder in my hand. The same folder Sheriff Brennan and I had assembled together, and I had practiced this moment in my head until I could not have done it any other way if I tried. I held up the contract he had given me 3 weeks before. Then I held up the photograph from my grandmother's video, the one where her hand was holding her real signature, the one where her thumb was tapping the small mark under the E. This is your contract, I said, and this is my grandmother's actual signature. I set them side by side on the porch rail. There is a mark under the E on every document she ever signed for the last 40 years, I said. A tiny mark, hers alone. Your forgery does not have it, because you did not know it existed, because you never met the woman. The smile on Crane's face flickered. That does not prove anything, he said. Handwriting varies. I lifted the journal. She wrote about you, I said, 8 years ago. She wrote about the day you came to her farm. She wrote about the contract you tried to push on her. She kept the unsigned copy. She wrote in her own hand that you would come back someday for whoever was left to inherit this place. The color started to go out of his face. I lifted the notarized letter. This is from Cornelius Whitfield, I said. Sworn and notarized 6 months before she died, certifying that she never did business with you. Not once. Not ever. Crane took 1 step backwards. Sheriff Brennan walked around the corner of the farmhouse. The 2 deputies stepped out from behind the line of pickup trucks at the edge of the yard. Walter Tanner was standing on his own porch half a mile across the field, watching his arms folded across his chest. Preston Crane, the sheriff said. His voice was very calm. You are under arrest for fraud, forgery, attempted theft by deception, and the Lord knows what else by the time we are done. Crane spun toward me. His face had broken open into something raw and small and ugly. "You got lucky," he spat, as the deputies moved up behind him. "You got lucky, that is all. A grandmother's letters in a cute little wood box. You got lucky, you stupid girl." I looked at him. I thought about the 7-year-old who had been told she was going somewhere safe. I thought about the 8-year-old who had spent her birthday alone in a group home, eating a cupcake out of a vending machine. I thought about the 11-year-old who had stopped unpacking her bag all the way. I thought about the 16-year-old who had stopped letting herself cry. I thought about the 21-year-old who 3 weeks ago had been sitting on a Greyhound bus with $47 in her pocket and no idea what was waiting for her. I thought about my grandmother, 247 letters, 47 videos, a locked box with a key hidden in the leg of a table. I thought about my mother, 3 days. It was not luck, I said. The sheriff's deputy was already snapping the cuffs onto Crane's wrists. "My grandmother spent 14 years preparing for this," I said. "My mother wanted me here. You are the one who does not belong." They put him in the back of the cruiser. Sheriff Brennan came to stand beside me as the engine started. "He is going away for a long time," he said. "We have enough for multiple counts. Henderson and Morrison have already agreed to testify. Vivian Kane is next. The county records show a pattern." He paused. "Your grandmother would be proud of you, Wren." I stood in the driveway long after the cruiser had pulled away. The dust settled. The sun climbed higher. Somewhere in the trees behind the barn, a robin started singing. It was over. 6 months later, I finished my first commissioned piece of furniture. Not the practice table that had held the key. Something larger, a dining table of black walnut 10 feet long. Joined the way she had taught me, finished with hand-rubbed oil, the way she had taught me. And the night I set the last coat on the wood and stood back to look at it, Walter Tanner stood beside me with his cap in his hands. "She would be proud," he said. I did not trust my voice. I just nodded. That night, Martha brought a pot roast. Sheriff Brennan came in his Sunday suit. Mr. Whitfield drove up from Burlington, and he set a small wrapped package on my new table, and inside it was a fountain pen that had belonged to my grandfather. Caleb sat across from me, and the way he looked at me had become a question we were both ready to answer. 3 years later, we were married in the barn. Walter walked me down the aisle because I had no father to do it. He cried the whole way. Martha cried before the vows even started. The whole town came. The pastor, the hardware store woman, Hollis, whose laugh I now knew the sound of, the farmers and the foresters and the families my grandmother had quietly held up for 40 years. Caleb's father stood up out of his wheelchair to shake my hand at the reception, and his hands were warm and rough, and he held mine for a long moment without saying a word. 5 years later, a young woman named Sable showed up in my driveway. She was 19. She had aged out of a group home in Albany. A social worker had heard about us, about what we were trying to build at the Callaway farm, and had passed her our number. She got off a bus in Burlington with 2 duffels and a backpack and a face I recognized as well as I recognized my own. The same closed-off look, the same hands wrapped tight around the strap of a bag that held everything she owned. I gave her a job, a bed, a workbench in the barn next to mine. I did not push her, I just let her be. 6 months in, she made her first piece of furniture. I watched her stand back from it. I watched her look at it. I watched something move across her face that I knew exactly. Pride. The dangerous, fragile, real kind. She turned and saw me watching her, and for 1 second I thought she might bolt. Then she didn't. She just looked at me. And I looked at her, and I nodded once slow the way Walter Tanner nodded at me on the morning he picked me up at the motel. She nodded back. Last summer I built a bench. I had been saving a piece of black walnut my grandmother had set aside on the high shelf with a tag in her handwriting that said, "For something important." The grain in that piece of wood was beyond anything I have ever seen. I had been waiting until I was worthy of it. The morning I started the build, I found I finally was. The bench is simple: 4 legs, a wide seat, a back the curve of a small wave. Every joint is hand cut. Every surface is hand rubbed. On the backrest, I carved an inscription I had been writing in my head for a long time. Eleanor Rose Calloway. She built with her hands and taught with her heart. I set the bench under the old maple tree at the corner of the yard, the spot where Walter told me she used to sit between projects watching the fields turn from one season into the next. On the fifth anniversary of the morning, I stepped off that Greyhound bus into Vermont. I sat on that bench at the end of the day. The sun was going down behind the western ridge. The sky turned through every color it knows. An old orange tabby cat I had named Sawdust climbed up on the bench beside me and curled himself into a circle on the warm wood. In one pocket, I had my grandmother's letter soft as cloth from years of unfolding. In the other, I had my mother's. 3 days. I want to come home, Mom. Caleb walked up across the yard. He had sawdust in his hair. He sat down on my other side and took my hand without speaking, and we watched the colors fade. Walter Tanner walked over from his own porch. He set one hand on my shoulder. He stood there for a long time without saying a word, the way a man stands beside a grave that does not feel like a grave anymore. Then he squeezed once and he turned and walked back across the field toward Martha and the lit windows of his house. The first stars came out. My grandmother had not given me my childhood. She could not. The system, the distance, her own fear had all stood in the way. I will carry the shape of those 14 years for the rest of my life. There is no piece of land big enough to make that go away. But she gave me a future. She gave me roots. She gave me a craft that will feed me until the day I lay my own tools down. She gave me proof in 247 letters, in 47 videos, and a hidden key in the leg of a table I built with my own two hands, that I had been loved every day of my life, even on the days when I was sure I was alone in the world. And sometimes I think that is the greatest thing one person can ever give another. The proof that you were loved, that you were always loved, that somebody was thinking of you even on the worst night of your life, even on the loneliest birthday, even when no card came in the mail and no voice called your name. You were not alone. You were never alone. You were a darling girl and somebody somewhere was waiting for you to come home.